Hello, my name is Jim Stone, and I am the author of a beginning reading and writing program called Animated Literacy. For the past 25 years, I've been traveling across the United States and Canada presenting literacy workshops for teachers and educational professionals. Prior to that, I spent over 25 years teaching in the classroom, the last 10 years of which I would teach during the day, and then many days I would present literacy workshops locally after school or on weekends. Now I'm in a position, like many people with coronavirus, where I'm trying to stay home and stay healthy and not catch the virus. So as I've been staying home, I've received many phone calls and emails from teachers asking if I can provide some sort of long distance instruction for those who are trying to help students learning at home and for parents who are trying to teach their children at home. So what I've decided to do is put together a series of videotapes, and my goal in putting the tapes together is that I can provide a comprehensive reading and writing program that parents can use with their children, teachers can use for remote learning, or they can use in their classroom. So I'm going to kind of walk people through the research behind animated literacy, the research behind what children need to know to be successful in their reading and writing. And my objective also is to provide a comprehensive enough set of materials that you can use these materials without purchasing anything and just be able to put together activities that I will describe and show you how to do at home. If you want to go beyond that and you want to look at the materials that are provided with animated literacy, we have a website that you can go to, and then after viewing the materials, if there's something that you want to purchase, if you're purchasing in the United States, there's information on the website to purchase with. If you're purchasing in Canada, you can contact our Canadian distributor, Bonnie Chappell, at Phonetically Speaking, and her email is Bonnie, B-O-N-N-I-E, Chappell, C-H-A-P-P-E-L-L, at gmail.com. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Animated literacy is based very heavily in three primary areas of research. We look at reading research to see what to teach, and all of this research is pretty recent. There was no real scientific study of reading to determine what good readers versus poor readers do until the 1970s. But that research didn't come out in print in the 1970s. It took a long time to complete the research and validate the research before you could begin reading about it. So it started really coming into print late 1980s and then much more heavily towards the late 1990s. The same is true for language research and for brain research. So we know an awful lot now about how the brain remembers, how the attention system works, what motivates children to pay attention. We know a lot more about how language is acquired beginning prenatally and going through the first years of life. And we know what good readers and poor readers do. So we're going to be putting that into the lessons. One of my favorite authors on the brain research is Robert Sylvester. And you're going to hear his name coming up a number of times in my presentation. He kind of opened the floodgates of brain research for teachers in 1995 when he published a book called Celebration of Neurons. And then he continued to publish additional books throughout his life. And I was fortunate enough to attend a number of workshops with Robert Sylvester, and he was an incredible presenter when he talked about brain research. And one of the things that oftentimes people are concerned about is whether the brain research is going to be too complicated. I love this quote from Robert Sylvester. He tells us, "Our brain is awesomely complex biologically, but elegantly simple functionally. Many discoveries from the brain sciences do not surprise us because we educators have been working with a room full of brains for a long time." And I know when I began my teaching career back in 1970, I often thought if I could just get inside the child's head and understand how they pay attention, how they process information, how they remember information, then I can be a much more effective teacher. And back at that time, that was a very difficult thing to do. But I tried just by working with children. And the same, once we had a child, trying to figure out how her brain worked and how I could get into that. Well, now with all of this brain research, it's no longer a guessing game. Now it's a matter of taking the research and what we intuitively have figured out about the brain prior to the availability of that research, and then applying it so that children can go on and be successful. This is a quote from Jane Bluestein that kind of follows right along with what Robert Sylvester is telling us. She tells us we have never known as much as we now know about how people learn and think and interact. This knowledge, however, comes with a certain degree of accountability. For where our predecessors may not have reckoned with the outcomes of the traditions they imposed or followed, we have come to know the cost of ignoring their potential impact. So when we look at the brain research and we look at children who are successful, we can see that they have followed along with strategies that the brain is compatible with. When we look at children who are unsuccessful, we now have a lot of answers in terms of why they're unsuccessful and how we can go about fixing that. But if we're going to do that, we have to pay attention to the research, which unfortunately isn't the case in most of our current reading instruction. This is a quote from Reading Research Quarterly in 2004, but the same is still true today in 2020. This says, very few scholars centrally engaged in literacy research know studies on language acquisition, and fewer still have reached into the neuroscience or cognitive science reports on memory, vision, or role play. And this really separates animated literacy from other reading programs. It does not look like or function like other reading programs, and the reason for that is because it uses an entirely different body of research that other programs are not based upon. When I first started teaching, there were many pieces of advice I was given that turned out to be rather outdated and incorrect. One of the first things I was told is when it came to emotion, I was told, don't smile till Christmas, because it was thought that emotion had very little to do with cognitive memory and being able to be successful in tests. And today we know that that's absolutely not true. This kind of went along with an old saying, no pain, no gain, that learning was to be difficult, it was to be hard work, and we really had to put our nose to that grindstone to be successful. This next area that we're going to talk about is one that really goes back to Robert Sylvester's statement that we as educators have been working with brains for a long time, and we know a whole lot about how they work. And certainly the same can be said about parents as well as teachers. And so we're going to be taking a look at emotion, attention, and memory. We're going to look at prior knowledge. Then we're going to look at the history of reading instruction over the last 150 years and at the results of that instruction to see how it's working. We're going to go back to Robert Sylvester for a moment. And this is what Robert Sylvester had to say about emotion that has not been incorporated into a lot of our reading instruction that comes from the big publishing houses. Robert Sylvester tells us emotion drives attention, which drives learning, memory, problem solving, and just about everything else that we do. He goes on to say that it is biologically impossible to learn something you're not attending to, and it's foolish to attend to something that's emotionally meaningless. And then he goes on to chastise the school for its lack of incorporation of emotion into teaching. He says the school's long-standing relative disinterest in exploring ways of incorporating emotion into curriculum has been a disaster. And certainly any parent who has looked into the eyes of a newborn child and wanted that child to respond to them, to interact with them, knows that if you don't do something emotionally significant, the child's not going to pay attention to you. So parents make silly faces, they stick out their tongue, they hide behind sheets, they jump out of places, and they do all this crazy stuff to grab the attention of the infant. And the same is true as that infant is growing into a toddler and into a young child. We have to have emotion if the child's going to pay attention. This is a wonderful quote from Priscilla Vale. She tells us that emotion is the on-off switch for learning. Emotion has the power to open or close pathways, doorways, or windows to learning. So that's one of the first things we have to look at, is if children are going to learn, they have to pay attention to what we're teaching. And if they're going to pay attention, we have to make it emotionally significant to them. This also plays into Marian Diamond's work. I was fortunate enough some years back to attend a workshop with Marian Diamond back in 1985. I had started developing animated literacy in the late 1970s, not as a reading program, but just as a way to survive in my own classroom and help my children become successful. Well, as I began developing the program, my test scores began to rise. When I first started, my test scores were pretty much like the other teachers in my school, and I was teaching first grade at that time. I had taught fourth through sixth grade, and now I was working in the primary grades. And I was working in a school that had the second lowest test scores in all of San Diego City schools, which is the second largest school district in the United States, and at that time it was the seventh or eighth largest. I mean, it's the second largest in California. At that time it was the seventh or eighth largest in the United States. The test scores for our first graders were averaging only about 15% of our kids scoring at the 50th percentile on standardized testing at the end of the year when we gave, at that time, the CTBS test. So I started incorporating things into my teaching, and at first the test scores went up very slightly. Then I started putting a lot of movement into the program, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. As I started adding a lot of movement to the program, suddenly my test scores took off. And I had 68% of my kids at the 50th percentile, while the rest of the first grades in my school were still back around 15%. Well, gradually, word got around that the kids in my classroom were reading, and I was hired to teach a series of courses for 9 years in the Chula Vista School District to the south of San Diego. And as more and more people learned about it, I was invited to present at my first conference back in 1985, and it was a accelerated learning conference. So when I went there to present, I had never heard of Marian Diamond, but she was the keynote speaker. Marian Diamond is the first person to really take a hard look at neuroplasticity. When she started her research, she was told that children's brains and their intelligence were fixed at birth, and that you could do nothing to change that. So she did rat studies, and in her rat studies she proved that if you raise a rat in a challenging environment where the rat has lots of toys to play with and lots of friends to play with, and they get to keep those toys for an extended period of time, their brain gets heavier, their brain gets larger in circumference, it gets more complex in growing in dendritic branching, the cerebral cortex gets thicker, and so you cause physical changes. And from that came the concept of neuroplasticity, which was pretty novel at the time, but now has been accepted by science, that we are molding the brains of the children that we interact with. And if we interact with them and mold that brain in the best possible way, that brain gets bigger and smarter. If we don't do it in the proper way, that brain actually shrinks. She goes on to say here what causes a brain to grow and what can cause a brain to shrink. She says an animal is only as smart as it needs to be. All animals' bodies are tuned to conserve energy, so nature programs parts of the brain to sharpen up when, and only when, experience demands it. So if we want children's brains to grow, they have to be in a challenging environment that they have to use their brain to grow into. If they're placed in a boring environment, then their brain actually shrinks in size and in weight. This is a second piece of advice I was given way back when I first started teaching, and I was told that the brain is like an empty vessel, and it was our job to fill that brain with knowledge. Well, now we know that children are not born empty-headed. They in fact have prior knowledge even at birth, and that prior knowledge continues to grow. One of my favorite books that we're going to be referring to a number of times in this presentation is The Scientist in the Crib, and it's written by 3 of the top researchers in language development, brain development, and in psychology. And one of the first things that we're told is that we've learned more in the last 30 years about what babies and young children know than we did in the preceding 2,500 years. So this validates that it was in the 1970s that we first began learning about how the brain works and having some scientific knowledge to be able to base our instruction on. This is, they tell us in Scientist in the Crib that children and scientists are the best learners in the world because they never start from scratch. Instead, they modify and change what they already know to gain new knowledge. So anytime we have input coming into the brain, if it's going to be comprehended and it's going to be remembered, it has to connect to the information that's already stored in the brain. So my first step now in teaching children is always to start out by saying, boys and girls, I have a lot of information to teach you. If you're going to remember any of the information I'm teaching you, we have to glue the new information that's being taught to the information that is already stored in your head. So the first thing we're going to do in every lesson is talk about the things that we already know. Why are we going to talk about those things? Because we have to glue the new stuff that's being taught to the old stuff that's already stored in our heads. Patricia Wolf has a good way of explaining this. She says that we have used the metaphor of the brain being like an empty vessel. It's really more like a sieve. Information goes literally in one ear and out the other ear if we don't teach it in the proper way. She tells us the brain is a pattern-seeking device, always looking for associations between information it is receiving and what is already stored. We're going to talk a lot as we're going along about pattern seeking, because the brain doesn't look for rules like we've taught many times in school. It looks for patterns. She goes on to say, if the brain can find no link or association, it is highly unlikely that the information will be stored in long-term memory. So it's going to go right through the sieve unless you can connect it to that previous information. But it's not enough just to connect it to any information. The role of emotion is huge in terms of those connections. Researchers who look at what happens when you're dreaming and when you're going through your REM sleep cycle, REM being rapid eye movement. So when your eyes are moving rapidly is when you're dreaming. The only dreams we remember are those that we wake up in the middle of, but we have numerous dreams at night. And a lot of those dreams are pretty illogical. What scientists now believe is the reason that we have these dreams that don't make any sense to us is that the brain during those dream cycles is taking information that has entered the brain that day and kind of bouncing it around, looking for an emotional connection to prior knowledge. And so if the brain can find an emotional connection to prior knowledge, you wake up the next day and you remember that information better than you did the previous day, and you'll continue to remember it because the brain keeps reinforcing those emotional connections. However, if the brain can find no connection to emotionally significant prior knowledge, then that information goes through the sieve and is pruned out. So we all know that when you cram for a test, it's not a great emotional experience. You're probably not spending a lot of time connecting to your prior knowledge. And so consequently, you may be lucky if you can remember that information long enough to take the test. And then as soon as you walk out of the testing room, the information goes through the sieve and out the other end. So if we're going to have children who actually remember what's being taught, we've got to glue that new information to the old information. In our next section, what we're going to be talking about is the history of reading instruction. We're going to take a look back at the last 150 years of reading instruction to see if it matches up with what we now know about the brain, and then we're going to take a look at the result of that reading instruction. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in our next section.